Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Judith Rolls, and I am the Senior Associate Director for Alumni and Family Engagement here at Davidson. I'm joined by my colleague, Anna Watson, who is our Digital Events Fellow. And we are thrilled to welcome each of you to this back to school class featuring Lauren Schultz Miller, class of '01, Greer Martin, class of '91, and Robert Lim, class of '91. In a moment, we'll begin our presentation, but before I do, I just want to share a few quick announcements. First, all participants have been muted, and we do ask that folks remain muted throughout the program so we can hear our presenters. However, there might be times where we would call on you to unmute if you have a question or a comment. If you're uncomfortable with it and have not already changed your Zoom name to your first and last name, if you're willing and able, we ask that you might consider doing so now. You can rename yourself by clicking the participants button at the bottom of your screen.
This meeting is being recorded.
And hovering over your mouse over your name, and then clicking the more or the ellipsis or three dots button. And if you have a Davidson class year, feel free to add that as well. It's just always fun for us to see who's on the call. If you have questions for the presenters, please share those anytime throughout tonight's program using the chat feature at the bottom of your screen. If you don't see the chat button, you may need to click the more button first. The presenters are going to do their best to answer as many questions during this evening's Q&A portion of our program towards the end of the call. If you have any technical or other issues, again, put those in the chat as well, and we'll be monitoring that throughout the program. And we have enabled the live audio transcription for this call. If you'd like to enable that on your end, you can click the Show Closed Caption or CC button on your screen, and subtitles should appear. Just please note that those captions are not always accurate, so we just ask for your understanding. Okay, and now for our program. Tonight's class includes a panel of three very impressive alums. Again, we have Lauren Schultz Miller, Davidson class of 2001, Greer Martin, Davidson class of 1991, and Robert Lim, Davidson class of 1991, each of which have translated the Davidson mission into extraordinary years of service. During tonight's discussion, we'll explore how their liberal arts foundation provided the framework for leadership and sacrifice within the military. From the classroom to the global stage, our guests will share how they've navigated the complexities of life in uniform while staying true to the Davidson spirit. It's a privilege to host this conversation of how these leaders continue to live out the college's purpose in defense of others. To begin, I'm going to ask each of our panelists to start by briefly introducing themselves, and then we will dive into some questions. Lauren, I'm going to ask you to go ahead and start us off, followed by Greer and then Robert.
Thanks, Judith. Thanks for this great topic. And it's been a pleasure getting to know Greer and Rob, and just really thrilled to be here. As Judith mentioned, I'm a 2001 grad. I grew up in Gettysburg, and that's where I live now. I just recently exited military service last month. And so I was just commenting this civilian world is new to me, so I'm navigating that now for the first time. I was a French major at Davidson with an international relations concentration. I studied abroad for a semester in Dakar, Senegal, my sophomore spring. I was involved with Davidson Outdoors, leading some Odyssey trips. I was on the Honor Council. I was a hall counselor in Rich for First Rich. I was the first class to have females live in Belk. So that was my sophomore year. And the two biggest and probably impressionable moments of my Davidson, or many moments, were that I played volleyball, and then obviously I did ROTC, and those groups are still good friends of mine. But thanks for the opportunity to introduce myself. I think I'm kicking it over to Greer.
Good evening, everyone. I am Greer Martin, class of 1991, famous as the Rob Lim class. I was a history major there, and like Lauren and Rob, did ROTC, Davidson and Washington, dabbled in club rugby for a little bit. Live in Raleigh, North Carolina now, born and raised in Charlotte, grew up there and went from Charlotte up to Davidson. I retired from the Army, about 3 years ago. My career path is distinct from Lauren and Rob's, in that I was reserved for most of my career with just the initial activity for training for the Field Artillery Officers Basic Course, and then mobilization deployment post 9/11, and then back to the reserves after that. So you've got a good little bit of diversity in career paths here that I think will be relevant to highlight sort of how our military works. That's all I've got, so I'll hand it over to my classmate, Rob Lim.
Hi, Robert Lim, class of '91. Basically, I joined ROTC because Greer told me to, along with a couple of my hallmates. I had a 3-year scholarship coming out of high school, and then next thing you know, I was suckered in and couldn't leave. They were pretty good guys, and I did note that as a wannabe physician, there were a lot of Davidson graduates who had gone on to be physicians through the military. So that actually got me kind of started knowing that there's a pathway to through medical school and training. You could still have a very successful career in both the military and as a physician. I did my 23 years in the military, retired from active duty in 2019. I've tried to stay active through surgical societies when the military is. In a lot of ways, it never leaves you because you do want to make things better, or at the very least, we all have stories that we want to tell somebody who's silly enough to listen to us about, when we were back in the war, this is what happened type of stuff. But I like to think that my Davidson experience wouldn't have happened at really any other college or university in the United States, because I was a studio art major, very liberal arts oriented, but I was a pre-med minor, knowing I was going into medical school. I was able to play on the tennis team. I proudly own one career recorded game in my 3 years of playing on the team, and that was because we had to extend the match to the 15th and deciding match. You can understand where my rank was on the team that year. Um, but being able to do that, do ROTC, be pre med, you just can't do that at a high level that you need to at a university where you have to bus to another part of the campus, where there's just time constraints and things like that. I like to say that I wasn't really good at any one thing. I was good enough at all little things so that ROTC wouldn't kick me out, and coach let me stay on the team for 3 years, shagging balls and whatnot. But that kind of experience, I don't think again would happen if you didn't get to immerse in it with a high level of classmates who were all engaged in that, and in a smaller area where you could physically do all those types of things. So very happy that I ended up at Davidson and I was able to do what I wanted to do. And I'm still a physician. I have practice in the Charlotte area. I work for Wake Forest Charlotte, and still do surgery. I do a lot of education, which is, I think, a very Davidson thing to do. Once you're too old to stay up all night, you teach somebody else how to do it. So happy to be here, and happy to answer any questions you guys might have later on.
Well, thank you again to all three of you for your willingness to be a part of tonight's panel. I am undoubtedly speaking for many folks on the call, where we are excited to hear even more about what you've already shared. And so let me start us off with our first question, kind of broadly speaking. And again, if any of you are want to just jump in, feel free. What was your Davidson experience like? As a student, did you imagine your path unfolding as it has? Did you picture yourself having a career in the military? Anyone want to kick us off?
Sure, Judith, I can go first. I think that my ROTC classmates and probably my sponsor at my first unit, well, who ended up being my husband, that's a different story, but would tell you that no, like they did not envision me having a 24-year career in the Army. I mean, literally, one of my first questions when I got to Korea was about the drip pan underneath the Humvee. I was asking why they were changing the oil right there in front of the command building, right? Like I was very green as a lieutenant. And I just, everything that I did know about the Army, like not being from a military family, being on a ROTC scholarship because I wanted to come to a place like Davidson, and watched my older siblings cobble together work study and loans and grants and all that. I looked for something that would help me financially be able to go to Davidson. Um, and so, it was a way to pay for school at first. And then it became so much more. I, told myself I would decide assignment to assignment how long I stayed in the military, and it just kept being fun. And I grew up kind of in a locker room that continued at Davidson with the volleyball team. And really, the Army was just, in my mind, one of the world's biggest team sports. And so that was a good fit. It worked out for me. Um, but no, I was, learned everything I knew about the Army, everything that I could from a lot of great and gracious ROTC classmates. Mike Petrowski and Ross Boyce, Matt Hurt, Andy Blanton, John Dickens. There was just 6 of us. Were very patient with me and spent a lot of time prepping for labs out in the woods and whatnot. But my Davidson experience was largely shaped by those ROTC classmates and the volleyball team. I was able to walk on to the team. So, Rob, similar circumstances. I was just so honored to be part of that team and love that I still have great friends there. But yeah, so no, did not envision. Honest answer, no, never thought I would have still been in the military 24 years after graduating from Davidson.
This is one of those areas where the difference in paths that Lauren and Rob took for mine, I think, is relevant. I was I'm not sure why I did ROTC in college, other than just some vague sense that it was part of an obligation to my country, but a very vague sense, and not one that motivated me to excel too much as a cadet. I think my experience at summer training, 6 weeks in luxurious, cozy Fort Bragg, North Carolina, was a little bit of a wake-up call, and got a much better understanding of what it takes to actually be able to do the job in the Army. I did not think at all that I would make a career of it. I figured I'd either go on active duty for um, one tour, or go straight in the reserves and go on to law school. And that's what I ended up doing, and figured that I would just be done once our initial 8-year commitment ended. But I found I really enjoyed it. And I wonder, Lauren and Rob, is it easier perhaps to enjoy it when you're only doing it part-time, as opposed to 5 days a week or 7 days a week in some cases? Um, but I loved it so much. I would pay the Army if they would let me keep doing it, but I hit maximum time in service. It was, other than marrying my wife, was the smartest decision I ever made. And they had to drag me kicking and screaming into retirement when I hit the end.
So, yeah, I would never envision me doing 23 years. In fact, every time I signed a contract, the first thing I did was calculate when would be the first time I could get out. Um, but as I mentioned before, there's a pretty long history of physicians serving in the military, especially coming from Davidson. Medical schools cost a lot of money. Either you're independently wealthy, you're willing to take a loan that would take you several years to pay off, or the military can pay for it. And I personally don't think there's a better financial package than what the military offers in terms of paying for medical school or law school. Now, of course, you have to serve in the military on the other end. But I think that's actually helped out my career a lot in the civilian world and in my during my military career. So one secret that once you pass residency, you have been in the military unofficially for about 5 to 6 years. So before you even start practicing, they promote you to major. And then as long as you don't do anything incredibly stupid, if you're there for 4 or 5 more years, you'll most likely make lieutenant colonel. Um, and so by the time you've done repaying back your service, you've already achieved a pretty significant rank. In my case, I signed on to do more, and I got a lot of credit for going for deployment, which also increases your chance of getting promoted. So I sort of backed into getting promoted all the way to where I did before I retired. But at the same time, I thought I was providing some pretty good surgical care and training other people. And doing it in the military, of course, there just aren't a ton of people to educate military surgeons because you're either off fighting in the war or you've retired afterwards. There's very few people who've been in the military system for 20 plus years to teach the next generation of surgeons. And of course, surgery that in on the battlefield is a lot different than surgery you'll see in downtown Charlotte. And so there's a different skill set that you need to have that. So because I liked education, because I liked my rank and I liked moving up in the world, I basically stayed for 23 years and kind of like Greer, would have probably stayed longer if the military would have let me stay longer. Um, and my wife had some say in that too. She was like, I think I'm done having you be deployed for long periods of time. That's another story, of course. But
You're going to talk
no,
about some of the things you did in your civilian career too.
Um, yeah, but that has a different motivation. But the bottom line is, I don't think anybody like necessarily goes and says, "I'm going to do 20 years in the military." Some people do. I'm sure, like my classmate Dave Taylor would have done that likely, and Mike Peters, another guy who did it for a long time, and they were kind of my influences when I was there. Again, I just followed Greer, Mike, and Dave, and next thing you know, I'd signed something up, and then I had 4 years later, I got a pin on my shoulder. But the bottom line is, I don't think anybody ever really knows. Again, no, there's no better financial package for a medical school. When your colleagues when they first start out, they have 300, $400,000 debt, and you have zero. It's a pretty good feeling to start your career out on. So I'll stop yapping here. We can go to the next question.
Well, thank you each for sharing. It should be no surprise that the honor code might come up this evening, being so ingrained into the Davidson culture. And so Davidson's honor code is a defining feature of student life. And so when you transition to the military's strict ethical codes, did it feel like a natural extension of your time in North Carolina? And was there a culture shock in how accountability is practiced? Like, how did being at Davidson with the honor code apply towards your time in the military? Or did it?
So the military does have some strict ethical codes, as do many government entities, um, and the practice of law. I think Rob, probably the practice of medicine has some also, but it did not feel in the military. It did not feel like I was anywhere near a culture of honor as I did at Davidson. That is not a slam on the military at all. I would say that the culture of honor that I found in the military was higher than in most other endeavors, but I did feel that it was distinct from Davidson. One of the in your military career, both in a deployed environment at war and in garrison, you're going to constantly be presented with ethical challenges. And if you are deployed, you are in an environment where the eyes of the world are upon you and you are representing America. Um, and there are numerous consequences for a failure to behave honorably. One of which, but not necessarily the most of which, is you can have some events that end up in the press and end up being reflecting negatively on our country, hurting our country's security. Looking at the treatment of detainees at various sites around the world is but one example. Um, but then in garrison, it is important, and this is a problem in the military that I expect Lauren and Rob saw. You are constantly giving reports to the higher headquarters on your units, the unit that you're leading's readiness. Some of it is very objective. How many of your soldiers have gotten their medical appointments done and their dental appointments done? But some of it is a little more subjective, giving an evaluation of the readiness of your unit to go to war. And there is a constant pressure to give a higher estimate of your unit's readiness than perhaps it really is. There is a fear that if you perhaps gave the honest appraisal of your unit's readiness, that it'll reflect poorly on you, and then you won't get promoted. Um, because the first question your commander is going to ask when you say, "Hey, boss, my unit's at a C level readiness." Well, all right, Captain Martin, why is that? What have you done to cause that? And it can be just a lot easier to say, "Hey, we are ready to go, ma'am. A plus. Let's do it." The problem with that, of course, is that when they're making decisions on what units are going to do what, and preparations for war, they're relying on those reports. So everywhere you turn in the military, I think, I don't know, probably more than the civilian world, but certainly the consequences of a failure to act honorably are much greater in the military world than in most endeavors in the civilian world.
So I would say having an honor code Davidson at that in that environment is a good time to learn a lot of things that Greer just talked about. If you're in the honor code in Davidson, it's more like plagiarism on your paper or on a test, whatever that format that might be. But you learn what that. I think you learn what it really means to have that kind of honor when you're handing in your own work. And I think it translates pretty well when you have to make decisions that affect other people around you. So, I mean, Greer's referencing when he was a leader. And as a surgeon, I wasn't always in that position. But you do make decisions that affect a lot of other people just by the nature of that position. And I'm sure Lorna will tell you the same thing. You have to have that honor when you're talking about other people. It's not just about making yourself look good in ways that get you promoted, but it's also about um, knowing that you're going to affect other people's lives when you make these types of decisions. When you give your opinion, it better be not just your personal opinion, but backed with the facts. And I think that I learned at Davidson pretty well. That's hammered into you. So I do. I don't know if it's easier translation because the stakes are a little higher, right? If I get an F on a test, I'll still survive. But if I make a poor leadership decision, somebody else may die. So that is a little tougher, like Greer talked about. But I think you learn it pretty well at Davidson. You get a good foundation for it.
Yeah, I'd second what Rob was just talking about. I think there were two parts of the Davidson Honor Code, well, two parts of my experience in the military where the Davidson Honor Code really set me up well. And one was just the expectation that I had for my peers, and how that culture at Davidson, the expectation that your hallmates or everybody on campus, all your classmates, had of you. I carried that into the military, maybe naively, but then I felt like I was a better um, peer leader, right? Pushing other lieutenants to abide by the same thing. And then my career was in the intel field, and I think the honor code, I would give it credit for giving me personal courage to say when I didn't know the answer, right? To the truth to power piece, being brave enough just to say, how sure I was in my assessment of you know, enemy movement or enemy intention, looking at things through the analytical lens and just being courageous enough to say, well, I'm probably only 50% sure. I think it would have been really easy to do what Greer was mentioning, right? Like to make yourself look better in front of your boss. And I think that the Davidson Honor Code really instilled in me, like, do what's right when no one's watching. Um, yeah, I didn't really realize that, Judas. That's a great question. I didn't really realize that till I was looking over the questions. So thanks for that question. Good one.
And one thing Rob said I thought was really resonant with me. You mentioned, Rob, that the consequences for failure to behave honorably in the military are much greater than at Davidson. And I think that highlights the role of the honor code, I guess a twofold role of the honor code. One, of course, it's there to govern our behavior as we're taking tests so that we don't perhaps get an unfair advantage over our classmates. But its greater importance, I think, is as a teaching tool. Just like you, Rob, I expect, in biology class, when you're dissecting a dead animal or something, the consequences of failure there are not near as great as they were when you're a surgeon out in the real world. But it's teaching you how to do what you need to do. And the same thing, the honor code, it's there to teach us how to prepare us for um, environments with much greater consequences. And I think we often forget how really the main good of the honor code is its role of a teaching tool.
Kind of building off of that, the college mission emphasizes lives of leadership and service. And in the military, leadership often requires, as you've been talking about, making these really hard calls. So how do you balance the Davidson purpose of serving others with the pragmatic demands of the military command? We've talked about how you balance the honor code in making those decisions, but how do you balance the Davidson purpose with the pragmatic demands?
Lauren talked about the Humvee out on the front with the drip pan underneath, and sorting through what that meant. It's hard to you in that moment, Lauren, I think didn't feel like, boy, I am really serving my fellow American as I'm doing this. So there's no shortage of drudgery in the military. Some really unpleasant stuff, some boring stuff, really mind-numbingly boring stuff also. And I think for me, once I understood the purpose of all those activities, there wasn't always a purpose, but usually there is, that I connected that to the bigger picture, which is that me sitting in that classroom getting a boring death by PowerPoint lecture, um, at Fort Bragg, that I was still, that was part of the service that I was performing to our country, to our community in the military. I didn't make it always easily bearable, but I very much understood and believed that I was there for a purpose, and that was every bit as much a part of my uh, career of service in the military as some of the more obvious aspects of it.
Yeah, so I actually refer to Davidson's motto when I think about this question, or I think about how I'm serving my country, right? Which is let learning be cherished where I think freedom, I'm going to mix it up a little bit, but where freedom is enjoyed, right? And we can maybe question the United States' role in freedom in the world, but that certainly, thank you, Mario, Liberty. Um, but that certainly, we enjoy a lot of freedoms, and we have that freedom to learn, and we should cherish it. And where education is flourishing, I mean, as a surgeon educator, which I do now at Wake Forest, I don't think there's any greater role for me to play than to be educating the next generation. And during my time in the military, there were just gaps in education, and I found a nice niche doing those things. And I do think it's part of Davidson's legacy to say, okay, hey, there's something here, and let's talk about it with different points of view, et cetera, and let's make this a learning, a teaching point. So I guess I don't know, it's not Davidson's mission, so to speak, but it is, again, Davidson's motto. And I think I was living it without even learning it. In fact, I gave a talk a few years ago, and I was talking about all the different places that I've worked, and they all had a motto. All the all the companies and platoons you work for in the military always have a motto of some sort. And so I just sort of recorded them, and I said, and I looked at Davidson and goes, you know what? I don't think I've ever really looked at it since freshman year, but I really felt that I was kind of living it with being a surgical educator and trying to find gaps in care that we can improve upon for the next generation. So again, I think it's a natural. And I imagine other people on this call and other alumni have found that to be the case in their experiences. So.
Judith, I think the only thing I'd add is just that, you know, the serving others, that part that's important to Davidson. I don't know if I was mature enough to really realize what that meant when I was at Davidson. And I think it probably took me until I had kids. See, I got in the Army in '01 and didn't have kids till '09. I was a different leader. I was a much more empathetic leader after I had children. I demanded a lot I was in company command without children and demanded a lot of my soldiers that had families, expecting the same of them that I did of my single soldiers. And I think it took having children and really reflecting upon, you know, understanding your people and what you're asking of them and making sure that you're asking something of them that you would do yourself or be willing to do yourself. And then I think as my military career progressed, I think always making sure that the question was, who am I serving here? Am I serving, is this response, is this answer, you know, is this stance I'm taking, I think it's this, and I'm really in this position. Am I doing this for the right reasons? Is this an ego thing? Is this a confidence thing? But who am I serving? And I think, I don't think I realized that while I was at Davidson, but I certainly think that, whether it's empathetic leadership or whether it's, serving a larger purpose or what is it in service of is something that I ask myself often in the second half of my military career.
Thank you. Thank you all. Changing it just slightly here. So many people view military training as rigid and technical, while Davidson's education is broad and largely inquiry-based. How did the ability to think critically across disciplines actually make you, or did it make you, do you think it made you a better leader in the military environment?
Two ways, at least, that a liberal arts background made me a better leader. One is ties in very much to what Lauren just said, empathy and understanding of the people that I'm serving and that I'm leading. The liberal arts are supposed to teach you about humanity and how human beings work, and the insights you get from a liberal arts education help you do that much better. But second of all, the way it teaches you to think, not just outside of the box, but to the analytical skills, the cross-cultural skills, all that you learn from liberal arts school are crucial, particularly in a deployed environment. I think I think Rob said earlier on we'd start telling war stories. One of the most challenging experiences I had was in Afghanistan, having to understand the Afghan conception of negligence. And in this I relied on my law school education, but in law school there's some technical classes, here's what the law is on torts, but then there's also some classes that are much more theoretical, very much liberal arts in nature. A comparative law class was one of them. So I had to understand the Afghan conception of negligence. In order to do that, had to travel to go see an Afghan lawyer general who didn't speak English, and I speak neither Dari nor Pashto. So I had an interpreter. Would have helped if the interpreter was an Afghan lawyer or had some kind of legal background to help me discuss these abstract concepts. But no, Rob, he was a doctor. Um, so having to think across cultures and both try to understand some very abstract concepts, and then also to convey the American sense of negligence relied on so much of how my brain learned to think at Davidson, combined a little bit with how law school, the more liberal arts aspects of law school, taught me to think, to apply the technical knowledge I had to communicating across cultures, across languages, across the medical discipline of my translator to the legal discipline of the Afghan general that I was speaking to. Incredibly challenging and incredibly fulfilling, and Davidson prepared me so well for that. Not quite sure I got it right, but
Well, if that doctor was an orthopod, then you were really in trouble. My medicine fans will appreciate my joke there. Um, well, probably the best lesson I learned at Davidson, which worked the rest of my life, is that Davidson will teach you how to solve problems with uh, more than one way. And that's the heart of liberal arts training. That's not necessarily unique to Davidson, but I do think Davidson's environment enhances that. So I was a Catholic guy from New York who went to one of those boarding schools, and so the phenotype that I saw for really brilliant people was one way up in the Northeast. When I came to Davidson, equally as brilliant people, but certainly a different background and phenotype. The way they, the way they talked. I tried to develop a Southern drawl, but it went away pretty quickly whenever I went back home. But the point being is that brilliance and intelligence comes in all forms, and finding answers sometimes comes through economics, through religion, through philosophy, through biology, through I don't know what I've missed so far. It's not really one way, because if there was one way, then that's how we'd all do it. And as we approach problems in life today, if you think only one way, probably not going to be too successful. And in the military, as Lauren said, there's no greater meritocracy or greater team than in the military, especially when you're downrange, because you really rely on other people, and to get through them, to communicate them, to lead them, to uh, get them to be on the same page. You cannot think just one way. You have to understand where they're coming from. You have to, again, some people identify differently, and it can be a real challenge to getting everyone on the same page of music if they come from 40 different backgrounds or more. So and I think Davidson does a pretty good environment. Of course, it's the South. My wife is from Georgia, so she doesn't think it's from the real South. It's the upper South. And you have to deal with some of that, right? There's great socioeconomic diversity um, at Davidson. A lot of international students and understanding their plight. There's a lot in a very I guess, smaller environment that you can really get to know them, right? If this was a large university in a big city, you may never see that. You can hang out with your like friends, and that's who you'd be with for the 4 years. There's nothing necessarily wrong with that, but getting out and seeing other way people think other ways. The big political debate. I'll get into politics. Was Jesse Helms and oh gosh, who was the other person running for Senator Helms and somebody. Anyway, it was a hot topic, and I was more against Senator Helms. But very, very intelligent people with very good arguments and very, enlightened points of view were telling me why I was wrong. I mean, they were of course wrong ultimately, but they presented a good argument. But I could appreciate the argument. I could appreciate the background of the argument, and saying that, oh, you're just being stupid is not a good way to argue, and it's not doesn't do anybody any good. So it helps to really understand where they're coming from and understand the way to communicate with them effectively, and to still have respect for them, even though you have a disagreeing opinion. Harvey Gantt, yeah, thanks. All right, I should just have you be my publicist, and and edit everything I say. But yeah, that was a hot deal when, and I learned a lot about propaganda and politics and and all the things that go on during these hotly debated political races. I do have to thank Davidson for that.
I shared with Greer and Rob and Judith and last week that my oldest is a junior in high school, and she's looking at colleges, and never has it been more in my face what a good choice Davidson was because of the people that I was introduced to. Um, those people shaped me, and lucky enough to still be friends with lots of them. Um, but that liberal arts where I was pushed to challenge my mindsets and biases that maybe I didn't even know that I had, um, by other people, challenging my beliefs, made me, you know, or other people interrogating my assumptions and then having to defend a position, all the while staying open to being wrong. I mean, if that's not military intelligence, I don't know what is. That was my whole job. Um, and so I just couldn't think of yeah, I just think a liberal arts degree, being challenged by your classmates and your peers, both in the classroom and out, prepared me better for that than anywhere else. I think my French degree, I think what Greer was talking about with language, was huge. How much meeting someone halfway in their language can shift the dynamic completely. Um, and beyond just French, the broader thing that Davidson built and pushed for me was just curiosity about other people. Just because there's so many interesting people, right? Whether they were your professors or your classmates, I was just always curious to learn more about people, and that served me very well. Um, whether it was mission related, probably more people related, right, and leading people related. Um, my semester abroad in Dakar, where I lived with a host family without hot water and sometimes with electricity, and going to the University of Dakar, that was most of the professors were on strike the whole semester, um, made me so grateful for what I had. And then that feeling resonated on deployments as well. And it was not that, my experience in Dakar was nothing like a deployment, but being comfortable with being out of my comfort zone was something that Davidson gave me the opportunity to do. And, like Rob had mentioned before, there's very few places that would let you balance playing Division I sports, being in ROTC, and allowing you to study abroad. There were concessions. I went sophomore spring instead of junior year so that I didn't miss any of the military science evaluations my junior year. But, um, I'm extremely grateful to both the cadre there at the time, Rob Geiger, who I'm still in touch with and promoted me to colonel, um, and Sergeant First Class Wright were great cadre members. And then Coach Lisa Marston, who allowed me to do a lot of things, both ROTC and studying abroad. I just think, again, that community, I know your question was about liberal arts degree, but just the uniqueness of Davidson was integral for me.
You can use that to your advantage too. So I would tell the tennis coach I ran the morning with ROTC, and then I tell the ROTC director, "Oh, I got to work out this afternoon for the tennis coach." So then I would never work out. It's
Yeah.
pretty good deal.
And
Um,
then guilt tripping your teammates into coming to, 6 a.m. PT. I think there's some on the call that
yeah,
did push-ups on the front of chambers with me. So
yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah, Maria asked about whether the military experience was part of the liberal arts, and are consistent with the liberal arts training, and I would wholeheartedly agree because the way the military looks at things is different than I think most of us know, unless we're actually in the military. Um, on the one hand, the military is a tool of the government, right, to be used and deployed, a show of might, if you will, or defender, which I think I'd like to consider us more as. But however you look at it, it's a government tool to be utilized. At the same time, there's no people who want more peace more than probably the soldier and the airmen and the people in the Navy, because they don't want to go to be under harm's way. Now they're willing to do it if the government asks us to do it, but there's no bigger person who wants peace than those people. And I don't think you really necessarily understand it because you spend all this time learning how to attack your enemy, counteract an ambush, call in direct fire from afar or whatever it is that you do your military training. But you also are trying to do it with honor, and you're trying to do it to save peace, to be, to maintain not just the U.S.'s peace, but peace around the world. So it's a different perspective when you're inside the military thinking about that. My military experience was stripes, I think, before I joined the military. Then my favorite movie became Platoon because I kind of understood more what they were going through. So, Cecily, you have your hand up. I know I'm not the moderator, but I'll call on you.
Yes, I arranged that with thankfully with Judith. She is allowing me to do this, and Maria's going to give me grief later for my contextual question. But I'm so happy to see you guys and hear all your stories, Lauren. It's a pleasure to meet you. I know these two guys really well. I actually did RTC for a year and a quarter, basically, freshman and sophomore year. And so we, along with Craig Norman, shared the experience of John Moncure as our lieutenant colonel, who, of course, had this sort of glamorous experience in the army of being with the French army and eating crepes in the back of a food truck. And, he made it all seem lots of fun. And he was pursuing his PhD. So you had this experience of leaders who had a lot of intellectual rigor and intellectual context, as we had at Davidson. And then there are obviously a lot of other leaders you may have encountered. You've talked a little bit about your own experience working with managing soldiers and sort of maybe managing downward, but looking at the context of the Army now or military overall, what are some of the things you learned from the leaders who helped to shape you moving up? And given the fact that, if I can say it, getting into politics, that there doesn't seem to be a lot of appreciation for intellectual rigor in the military right now, what do you think is the hope for the future in terms of leadership development and direction for the military?
Well, I remember, Cecily and Rob and Craig, when we first got to Davidson, particularly, a lot of the cadre, the senior cadre, were Vietnam veterans. Colonel Deal, and several others. And I learned many things from all our cadre, but one of the things that stuck with me was that these were the people who, in the post-Vietnam era, a very difficult time to be a leader in the military. They stuck with it. And they're the ones that rebuilt the military to the institution that was able to perform so well in Desert Storm and that was ready to take on the challenges post 9/11 also. And I think fairly early on, I got a sense of appreciation for what that meant. But I particularly appreciated that as I came to the end of my military career, feeling an obligation to hand off a military as good as the one that they handed off to me. Recognize that I only had a very limited ability to influence that, but I wanted to make sure that I did everything I could within my limited authority to pay that forward to the next generation.
So I'll say, the I really appreciated my professors in military science because they just had a different leadership style. You're kind of used to, again, to seeing the yelling, the bravado, I can do anything type of leader. And that's not most leaders in the military. As I look back on it, I actually appreciated Captain Strong, who was my one of my first guys I met in RTC. He's just a quiet guy, and he just got things done. Right, there was a reliability amongst him, and he would do PT with us. Not the strongest PT guy. Nothing, nothing wrong with him, but he wasn't the strongest guy. Didn't yell at us to get us to do things. Didn't I don't know how else you would put it. He wasn't an interface kind of guy, but got everything done. Took great care of you. Took great cared about the cadets a lot. Made sure they were prepared. And there was I think, a beauty in learning different ways to lead. Dr. Moncure, as we mentioned, very flamboyant, very, very French, if you will. I was actually deployed with a French forward circle team, and I can tell you that's all accurate. They actually brought their own refrigerator and food with them. They had military scarves and skinny pants during the war in 2018. And they would take time out around 4 o'clock to cook. So they couldn't take any patients from like 4 to 8 because that was their time to cook and have a fresh meal. Yeah, they were terrific. Good surgical team, but different priorities than we had in the military in the U.S. military. But again, I appreciated his style because he was really proud of the military and he took great pride of the cavalry. That was his MOS and what it meant and what the history of the military meant and what it meant for us to be uh, officers in the military with that kind of background. I could go down the list about the different leaders, but what I really appreciated was different leadership style. And as you learn leadership as a cadet, you really learn there's other styles too. I mentioned Mike Peters. I consider Mike one of my best friends. He used to yell at me all the time for being too lazy and for not running hard enough. I'm like, dude, we just we were just hanging out. What's going on? Well, you turned on me. Dave Taylor was the opposite, even though they were kind of the same background. He was very nurturing and take you under his wing and all this kind of stuff to make sure that you were taken care of. Um, Ick Willard, I know I see Jenny is on the phone earlier. Ick was very nurturing also and very like, dude, we just got to do it. And he would lead us and he would do it. So different styles, but all very successful ways of doing things. And again, I can go down the line from all my years from being there. And again, I think in Davidson being a little smaller, being ways you can really know people, it does translate better into the real world when you have to deal with larger groups. I don't know if that answers your question necessarily, Cecily, but I do think there's a role for being a different kind of leader and bringing that talent, that special talent to your group because it all counts in the end, whether you're a loud guy or a quiet guy or a PT god or like me, just did enough to stay on active duty. It doesn't matter as long as you're able to do your job and do it well. Nobody cares if the surgeon can do push-ups. I mean, I can tell you that for sure. And if you don't want to be deployed downrange, then don't be a surgeon because we go very frequently because they always want us downrange. So I was Kid Mike, who was an infantry guy, dude. If I wanted to stay behind, I guess I should have stayed in the infantry. He's like, yeah, we never deploy anywhere.
Rob, I will jump on for someone who did their war college year in Paris. I know a tough duty, but someone had to do it. I will tell you the boxed lunch was not a fan favorite of my French classmates. They wanted obviously their wine with our lunches. Even if we were out, we were having, we were basically at an army base getting an Army 101. Yeah, the box lunch, not a big fan of that. It was better than any box lunch I've ever had in the U.S. Army, but anyway, didn't rise to the culinary expectations.
Agreed.
But Cecily, you asked the question. You know, I've thought about this a lot. I think early on, for me, and this is kind of an unfortunate answer, but it's the truth. I was shaped more by bad leaders than I was by the good. I learned very quickly what kind of leader I didn't want to be. Um, and not that there were a ton of bad leaders, but just, the ones that were in my, organization or whatever. And not that they were allowed to be bad leaders, but, I just remember very specifically, I was a platoon leader. My company commander was supposed to report to the battalion commander to talk about, we had a particularly bad weekend. There had been some sexual assaults or whatnot, and the company commander was supposed to report to the battalion commander to brief what our action plan was going to be, how the company was going to, mitigate sexual assault in the future, and we couldn't find the company commander. So myself and two other lieutenants went to the battalion commander instead and briefed them. But that was like a significantly traumatic event for me, standing in front of the battalion commander, acting like I was in charge when I wasn't. And so I felt like that made such an impression on me that I wanted to make sure that the people that I led never saw those type of examples. And then it wasn't until much later, that I worked for, uh, when I worked for Defense Intelligence Agency and the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, that I worked for general officers, that I saw them, uh, you know, kind of to your second part of your question, in the time that we are today. And Judith, I see the time, but making sure that they were doing what they thought was right, no matter who their leaders were above them. They're understanding their role as military members, understanding what they were supposed to, what their job was to political appointees in the Defense Department, and watching that was really inspiring. And in the last 5 to 10 years, whether I was on the Joint Staff, briefing the chairman, the G2 of the Army, the multiple of them, just getting to watch them. There was some really impressive military officers that I believe, I'm an optimist, will still continue to do that no matter what political appointee is above them. Maybe to the detriment of their career, but I don't think the military has changed in that way. And then my last job was at the Army War College. I was in charge of fellows like myself who got to go to Paris as an Army War College fellow. And we really appreciated the diversity of thought that we gained by sending Army officers at the senior level, senior lieutenant colonels and young colonels, to 90 different fellowships across academia and across the world. We thought we were a stronger Army for the diversity of thought that we gained. We were not concerned about, the people that we sat in the classroom with not respecting us. I visited lots of those institutions, and I can attest that they valued our opinion and we valued theirs. And I believe that, hopefully, as I said, I'm an optimist. We'll get back to that at some point. We're still out at different academic institutions. We've been diminished slightly in our numbers, but we have a lot of champions of Army and all services being amongst, being in the classroom and sharing our 20 years of defense practitioner experiences with future policy writers, future decision makers, some of the best and the brightest in this nation and across the world. So, hold on hope. I have it. I hope you can too.
Thank you. Amazing. And Cecily, thanks you too. Great questions. We are coming up, or we're just past the hour, and so I want to be mindful of time. I do have one last, hopefully kind of rapid fire answer question question for you all to close us, pun/no pun intended. With when you all think back to your career, what part of your Davidson self are you most proud of having kept intact throughout all the years of service? Is there one thing that you can think of?
My friends. I love that, we make effort to come back together. Some of them are on this call, volleyball teammates who ran the time mile with me. One of the hardest things I've ever had to do, and reflected back on that many times, that I could do hard things, right? And did it at Davidson, I could do it elsewhere. But yes, that's the most proud thing that I continue, is the connections with people and friends.
So I think I'm most proud of the fact that Davidson has a very rich military tradition, and I hope that won't go away anytime soon. Before we got there, and, there's very strong officers that were in the military, and I do think it's part of the curriculum, maybe unofficially, like Maria has suggested. But everywhere I've gone in my military career, I have found another Davidson alum doing great things in the military. My first deployment in 2003, our brigade commander was a Davidson graduate. He was a full colonel at the time. And I actually didn't know it until I read it in the journal after I got back. Um, I wrote him a letter, just to say, fellow Davidson guy. I think I went on a total of 6 deployments, and each time there was a Davidson grad. Usually it's another surgeon. Don't get me wrong. So it's a little smaller field, but there's usually the medical field, but usually another Davidson grad nearby, which was a very proud thing for me because it just goes to the history of Davidson and the military. I think it produces good officers too, not just good Davidson grads, but good officers because of all the things that my fellow graduates have talked about today. And I think it'll always be there. I think Davidson grads make good military officers. So I guess I'll end by saying that.
Lauren said earlier that she didn't fully, I'm paraphrasing Lauren, so tell me if I get it wrong, didn't fully grasp really what Davidson's commitment to service was when you were there. And I don't know if you saw, I was nodding my head vigorously because I sure as heck didn't understand it there. But I do think that the college planted a seed in me. And so I think the thing that sticks with me from my time at Davidson is the demand of Davidson that its graduates lead lives of leadership and service. I make no claims to having lived up to that demand, but I feel that joyful pressure
You have, come on now.
from the college every day, and I'm humbled, Rob and Lauren, by the example set by our fellow ROTC graduates and our other classmates who are doing so much to make the world a better place.
Wow. Thank you all. And I agree, or I'm going to guess everyone would agree if I say all three of you have certainly lived out and then some, as beautiful examples of lives of leadership and service. And we thank you all for your service, as well.
I see Craig Norman noted he's, I think, challenging us. Soldiers are kind of competitive, and so he's pointing out how many RDC alums made it to the class of 1990 reunion. Ours is coming for June. Anyone in the class of 1991 who's on this call who has not signed up yet for our reunion, you're wrong. Drop and give me 20 or go sign up.
Yeah,
I love
Mike
it.
told me today, Mike Peters told me today he's going to come to the 91st, the class of 91 reunion. So I fully expect him to start yelling at me to do that cake run on Saturday morning, which
You're gonna do it, Rob?
no.
Come do it, and
I'm
then
gonna do it.
we go straight to the memorial service right after it. There's
All
no better
right.
way.
Oh man, that's
Ah, come on.
all right. All right. Is there a bike option?
Yeah.
Craig, thanks
There's
for
a
the
golf cart
encouragement.
option.
A golf cart option, yeah.
Well, and so a few things. Thanks to not just our panelists, but to certainly anyone else on the call who has served service to their country. We are grateful for all of you and all that you do and have done, truly. And um, if I may say again, not as a Davidson grad, but what I do know to be true about the Davidson experience is just what we're experiencing here. This good old Davidson competitive spirit. Of challenging one another. I would add that maybe to all of your answers of things that have maintained throughout your time. But I really do want to thank our three panelists this evening. So many thanks to Lauren, many thanks to Greer, and many thanks to Robert for taking the time to lead it's really, quite honestly, it's a very powerful conversation tonight. Really, so incredibly grateful for you sharing of yourselves in all the ways you do, and then particularly this evening in this conversation. For everyone on the call, a follow-up email will be sent um, for any kind of follow-up pieces. There'll be a short survey and some other helpful information. Um, This was recorded this evening, and so for anyone who wants to go back and listen or knows maybe someone who they think would be interested to listen to this program, it'll be on the website in the next few days. And so certainly do feel free to share out the link. We're happy for anyone and everyone to really learn from and enjoy the discussion of from this evening. Really grateful again to everyone who dialed in this evening.